disparities in our city and offer ways to make meaningful change. A brief biography of each is included in the program. Laura Richards will serve as moderator for this conversation. Laura is a longtime member and former chair of the Committee of 100 with expertise in zoning, the Height Act, and the comprehensive plan. She has lived in the Penn Branch neighborhood of Ward 7 since 1987, and before that lived in the Anacostia Historic District. She is a retired federal lawyer and former newspaper reporter and is active in civic and community affairs. Laura has served as a mentor for many of us within the Committee of 100. We will reserve time for questions from this audience. We ask that you please write your questions on the note cards provided and pass them to the outer aisle for pickup once Reverend Lamar has completed his remarks. Please keep your questions succinct and easy to read. After the program, please join us for refreshments and conversation in the narthex. Since I hope we have sparked your interest in the Committee of 100, please talk to me or any of the other members of the Committee of 100 identified by badges to learn more about our organization. We welcome new members, and we hope to see you back here for our next event, which will be on climate change and be held a month from now on Saturday afternoon, March 11th, from 1 to 2:30 p.m. We are pleased that Peter Tatian can start the conversation today on racial equity, a topic that is in danger of becoming a catchword, not a reality. The comprehensive plan amendments of 2021 have paved the way for our city agencies to analyze the consequences of their means and methods toward this end. Just this morning, the Office of Planning held a meeting next door at the MLK Library on how to assess racial equity in its work. Peter, your perspective on housing and community development in the district, developed over more than 30 years at the nationally recognized Urban Institute, has never been more vital in grounding the discussion of policies and practices to create a truly equitable city. And with that, I'll turn this over to Peter here.
Great. Well, thank you very much and for that kind introduction. And thank you, everyone, for being here today, especially on such a nice day outside. We're really glad that you're sharing some of it with us today. And I hope my remarks can help set the stage for a good discussion this afternoon. So as was said, I'm Peter Tatian. I'm a senior fellow at the Urban Institute. Urban Institute has been in DC for over 50 years, doing high quality policy research and helping use evidence to inform many of the important decisions that our society has to make. I also head up what we call Urban Greater DC, which is Urban Institute's initiative focused on DC and the Washington area. So the DC region and the district have been a particular interest of mine as a longtime DC resident, as well as a professional researcher. Here we go. This is a chart I include in many of my presentations, so some of you may have seen it before, but I like to include it because it gives a kind of a framework for the overall history of DC. And one of the points I usually make with this slide is that DC is constantly changing. So there's never been a point in our history where we are not experiencing some kind of change from, the early growth that we experienced since the city was founded to the more rapid growth that occurred through the 1940s and 50s, and then the period of population decline from about 1950 through 2000, and now a new period of growth in our city. So those tracked out through that top line that you see here. So the latest decennial census puts our population at about 690,000 in 2000. The decade 2010 to 2020 was actually the fourth fastest growth in population in DC's history. Only the 1910s, 1930s, 1940s saw larger numbers of people increasing in terms of living in the nation's capital. And also, we know that this growth, of course, was not even throughout the city. Although all 8 wards grew, Ward 6 accounted for about a third of the total population growth in DC. The latest Census Bureau estimates put DC's population at about 670,000, so 20,000 less than what that 2000 number was. I think there's some reasons to maybe question the accuracy of that number. There's a lot of things about the population estimates, particularly in the past year, in terms of people trying to make decisions about what their where they're going to live, that might mean that number is not wholly reliable. But I think that, we can see that, or my feeling is that DC is going to continue to grow for some years to come. And I think this growth is a welcome change from the half century of population decline that we saw earlier. I don't think it's a healthy thing for a city to be continually losing population. So it's good news that the city is growing again. But the thing I want to highlight, and I'll continue to come back to in my talk, is that as you can see here, despite the growth in DC's white population, Latinx population, and Asian population, DC's black population, which is represented by the blue line, has continued to decline in absolute numbers. And it's an important point here is it's not just that other populations are growing, and so the black population is a smaller percentage. It's also that more black people are leaving DC. There we go. Sorry for that awkward pause. So in thinking about that, we need to look at some of the social and policy context that has shaped many of those changes. I really want to recommend this report, The Color of Wealth in the Nation's Capital. You can find it at the link here. And I should add, I'll make my slides available, and they'll be posted on the website afterwards. But you can also just search for Color of Wealth in the Nation's Capital. My colleague, Kilolo Kijakazi, particularly in the first chapter of this report, did an outstanding job of talking about the history of systemic racism over 2 centuries that have contributed to the wealth gap we see in the nation's capital today. So starting with slavery, but also including things like laws that prevented black children from attending free public schools in DC, and refusals by the district government to spend money on schools for blacks. It also included black codes in the 1840s that prohibited blacks from owning and operating eating establishments and taverns and denied them licenses for any trade other than driving carts or carriages. It also includes urban renewal of the 60s and 70s that displaced about 23,000 predominantly black residents in DC's southwest neighborhoods, and destroyed about 1,500 black-owned businesses. So when we think about some of the things that we're seeing today, I think it's very important to have this historical context as well. And as a result of this, in this particular report, they note that the consequence of all of this is that today, white households in our region have a net worth that is 81 times greater than black households in our region. I also wanted to highlight just on this slide, the cover for the report, this photo by Gordon Parks called American Gothic, which was taken in 1942. It's a portrait of Ella Watson, who was a black woman who cleaned offices in the Farm Security Administration where Mr. Parks was working. And I wanted to note there's an historical marker at 11th and P Street Northwest near the home where Ms. Watson lived. And so if you're in the Logan Circle area, I hope you'll try to stop by and check that out. Okay. So Another consequence of this is some of the disparities we see across neighborhoods and wards in the city. These next few slides are from a tool from Urban Institute's website that can be reached through the link that I have here, urban.is/DC equity. And it allows you to compare various conditions across DC's wards and neighborhoods. So in this example here, I'm comparing the share of full-time workers who live in particular parts of DC and how many of them have earnings of over $35,000 a year, which is roughly equivalent to DC's living wage. And that you can see here in the Deanwood neighborhood cluster, which includes Deanwood, Burville, Grant Park, Lincoln Heights, and Fairmont Heights, 57% of full-time workers make that $35,000 living wage amount. Compared to Georgetown, Burlington, and Hillendale, where 91% of full-time workers make that amount. So if we were to close the equity gap, we call it, between Deanwood and Georgetown, that would mean that over 1,300 more full-time workers in the Deanville cluster would have earnings over $35,000 a year. Okay. Another metric that's actually one that's featured in the Comeback DC plan is how many people live within a mile of a major grocery store. And so that's another indicator we have on our site. And so again, in this case, only 21% of people living in the Deanwood neighborhood cluster had a major grocery store in 2018 within a mile of their location, compared to 100% of people who live in the Georgetown cluster. And so again, if we were to close this equity gap, we'd need another 10,000 more people in Deanwood to be within 1 mile of a major grocery store. And we can also kind of flip this and look at it a little different way. In this slide, we're looking at the number of home sales in the neighborhood that were affordable to the average household headed by a person of color. In this case, that was about $68,000 per year in 2017. And so in Georgetown, only 1% of homes, so there were 202 homes sold in 2017, and only 2 of them were affordable to somebody at that $68,000 income range, compared to, again, the Deanwood cluster, where 37% of homes sold were affordable. So again, to close the equity gap, we need another 73 more homes per year in Georgetown that were affordable to people at $68,000. So all of these things, of course, contribute to the story of how DC is changing and what DC looks like today. I wanted to dive in a little bit more on some of the population changes, in particular the change in the Black population in DC, and looking at it by ward and decade. So I think this also shows that there's some nuance to the story depending on what part of DC we're talking about. So in places like Ward 1, Ward 4, and Ward 5, there's been a pretty steady decrease over these 40 years of the Black population. But in places like Ward 2, we saw in the last decade there's actually a small increase. Ward 3 actually had the largest increase in Black population over the past decade, something that surprised me when I first saw those numbers. But the Black population in Ward 3, of course, is still rather small compared to other wards. And then in Ward 7 and 8, the other thing I wanted to note here is that you see the very deep losses in Black population in the 80s and 90s. And that's really slowed, and even in Ward 8 over the past decade started to reverse itself. So it's not only gentrification that contributes to displacement, depending on where we are. Disinvestment can also contribute to displacement. And I think that's the story behind those changes in the Ward 7 and 8 numbers that we see here. So what do we do about this? So I have a few thoughts about that to share. One thing I'll start talking about is housing affordability. For people to have the ability to remain in DC and benefit from the new growth and prosperity, they have to be able to afford to live here. And a part of that is providing enough housing that's affordable to people at different income levels. So this analysis that Urban Institute did a few years ago shows how much housing at different cost levels we would need to accommodate projected population growth in the region over the 15 years from 2015 to 2030. So over 65,000 more units in DC alone, and you can see how that's broken out according to these cost bands here. And of course, this is not a problem that DC faces alone. We have a regional housing market, and so other jurisdictions also need to increase their production of affordable housing. And in fact, Urban Institute has been working with the Housing Association of Nonprofit Developers, or HAND, to track progress on these housing goals using the Housing Indicator Tool, or HIT tool, which is a website that you can also access as well, so you can see how DC and other jurisdictions are making progress towards these and other housing goals. But in addition to, just producing more housing, the other thing we say in our report is we want to be really clear that there are actually other things we need to do as well. And we actually talk about the 3 Ps. We need to preserve existing affordable housing, we need to produce more affordable housing, and we need to protect renters and home buyers from discrimination and displacement. I sometimes find when I have these conversations, there are people who maybe want to focus just on one of these things, but our message is that no, we really need to do all 3, and they're all important. I like to think of it as like the 3-legged stool. Right? So if you take away one leg, what happens? The stool falls over. So we need to do all 3 of these things, because even, for example, if we are producing more affordable housing and trying to do efforts to preserve, people can still be displaced. There's other things that can be happening that would cause people to be displaced. So we need to make sure that protection items are in there as well. And to give you some example of what that looks like, we have in our report some different policy tools we discuss, and highlighting 12 of them here, some things that DC is already doing. Again, this is a regional report, so we're highlighting tools for the whole region. But in preservation, providing more financing so that apartments can be preserved for affordable housing. In terms of producing, looking at zoning and other restrictions that might inhibit us from creating more housing. On protection, providing more locally funded housing vouchers, which is something that DC actually is doing, or providing other types of assistance to increase the supply, to make sure people don't get displaced. One thing you don't see here that I would add now if I was writing it is eviction prevention, and that's something that we've been working on with other partners in DC over the past year and a half through the pandemic, trying to strengthen tools and approaches we have to prevent people from being evicted if they have short-term drops in their income, for example, or other conditions that might put them at risk of being evicted. I wanted to highlight on this slide as well that there is fair housing is a big part of this story. And there is a draft regional fair housing plan that Urban Institute and other partners worked on that is available for public comment through March 31st. This is the first time in at least 2.5 decades that the region has created a regional fair housing plan. And so it can be found on the Council of Governments website. And I encourage you all to take a look at it. There's a DC section, as well as sections for other jurisdictions, and to comment on that so that your comments can be included in the final version that will be published at the end of this year. And so, my final message on this slide is just that we need many tools in the toolbox. So it's not a question of like one thing being the answer when it comes to affordable housing. It's all of these things together. So the last thing I want to talk about is equitable development planning, and the importance of that, and the importance of having a comprehensive plan for equitable development. And I want to elevate the 11th Street Bridge Park's equitable development plan. We have the director of the 11th Street Bridge Park here with us today, Scott Kratz. And he and his team have really done incredible work to create from the very beginning a concept and a plan for equitable development to go with the 11th Street Bridge Park, which will be a new public space built over the Anacostia River. This plan has become not only a model for DC, but a model for other people around the country. And I want to know there's some very specific things in it that, of course, are important, but there's really 3 things I want to highlight about why I think this is an important plan to think about. One is the idea of creating partnerships. So the Bridge Park realized at the very beginning that there were a lot of things that they wanted to try to see in terms of equitable development, and they couldn't do all of them themselves. They needed to partner with others, the city, but also community-based organizations, other nonprofits, to do these things. So having strong partnerships is a big part of an equitable development plan. Second thing is really engaging fully with residents about what they want and need, and doing that early and often. And that is another important thing that should be an element of any good plan. And finally, measuring progress and holding yourselves accountable for results. Those are three things that you'll find in the Bridge Park plan and should be part of every equitable development plan. So when we look at things like the comeback plan that was introduced by DEMPED recently, what I would like to see more in that is where is the equitable development plan that goes with that plan? I mean, there certainly is a discussion of equity within the comeback plan. But for example, and this was part of the discussion last time, the mayor and the council chairman were asked about how we can make that plan more equitable, and one of the answers was, well, we're going to create a lot of jobs, a lot of good jobs. And I think that's great, but how do we make sure that the people we want to get those jobs will get those jobs? Why would it be, the long-term DC residents, for example, and not others who might come from outside? And again, I think this is one of the great things about the Bridge Park plan. They thought about everything from construction, and with the comeback plan, there's going to be a lot of construction downtown if this is what we do. So there'll be construction jobs. Are we going to make sure that DC residents get those construction jobs? There are probably opportunities for other businesses, small businesses. Are we going to make sure that Black-owned businesses, which is again called out in the plan, but how are we going to make sure that they have those opportunities to benefit from that development that's taking place? So I think you need to plan for equity. If you don't, we know the history is the development will be inequitable. That is the default. So unless we deliberately make plans to be equitable in how we do things, we will almost certainly see that pattern repeat. So thank you very much. I appreciate your attention, and I look forward to hearing any thoughts and questions you all have in a bit.
Well, thank you. And certainly the Committee of 100 also agrees with you that the comeback plan needs to be more equitable. Moving on, our next speaker, racial equity is not just a data set or a performance assessment. Racial equity is a profoundly moral issue with vast human impacts. Reverend William Lamar, pastor of the Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church, brings a prophetic voice to this subject from his active involvement over many years in social justice and theological teaching. He has witnessed the impact of racial inequity on his congregations in Florida, Hyattsville, and now Washington, D.C. Welcome, Reverend Lamar. You come to us with high recommendation from several members of the Committee of 100 who have been inspired by your words.
Thank you very much. This is such an extraordinarily beautiful space, and I'm just drinking in all of the thoughtful architecture, the light that streams in and illumines our afternoon. I'm most appreciative. And I also hope that after I will have shared, you will allow those who recommended me to stay in your organization. That was a joke. Thank you. Thank you. I have a tremendous amount of respect for policy folk, and in my dreams, I am a policy person. And I do appreciate the intellectual heft that they give us. And when the political power that we all have is married to that heft, I believe that we can indeed see in this city what we all dream. Would you join me for a moment of stillness and centering? I want you to hear these words from what we in our Christian tradition call Genesis chapter 15, verses 17 through 21. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between the pieces. And on that day, the Lord made covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants, I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, from the land of the Kenites and the Kenizzites and the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. The beginning of my freedom and awakening was to stop worshiping any god who would displace a people from their land. I heard this story over and over again, and I consumed it uncritically as a child growing up in church. I preached it fervently. And then I read a beautiful article entitled Canaanites, Cowboys, and Indians. A stunning and elegant and simple and blazingly brilliant piece by an indigenous Christian theologian named Robert Allen Warrior, who is now on faculty at the University of Kansas. I commend his work to you. He's a citizen of the Osage people. And what he forced me and others who engage with his work to reckon with is, what about all of these displaced people? All of us in this room, every last one of us, have a heritage of displacement within our ancestry. All of us come from people who have been displaced by stronger, greedier people with superior weapons and a theology of a God who cheers and applauds conquest. We are all in some way Kenites and Kenizzites and Cadmonites and Hittites and Perizzites and Rephaim and Amorites and Canaanites and Girgashites and Jebusites. The history of land is the history of Christian and Jewish scripture. The history of land is the geopolitical story on the headlines of the Washington Post and the New York Times. The story of land is what's happening in Russia and China and Brazil, and even in our own American empire, land is still the top story. And whether we construct hateful religious narratives or narratives of anti-Blackness or narratives that are anti-Semitic or narratives that some humans are less than others or narratives that some humans are intellectually inferior or narratives that some humans are ontologically criminal, under all of these false flags, these dehumanizing stories, we always find ultimately divine sanction for conquerors. We know the war on drugs was an anti-Black policy. And this is not Bill Lamar's opinion. These are the words of John Ehrlichman, assistant to President Nixon for domestic affairs. Quote, you want to know what this war on drugs was really about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. You understand what I'm saying? This Ehrlichman. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either a war on Black people or on the hippies, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about drugs? Of course we knew. This is the seedbed of displacement in American cities. A toxic, demonic, economic, and political concoction that made cities safe to clear, thus purchasing land cheaply and rebuilding in many places extravagantly. There is a word that we are afraid of, and I was sharing with Scott yesterday when he was kind enough to allow me to come into his office and to see the extraordinary work that they're doing. A word that we are afraid of that I think we have to bring back into our vocabulary. And that word is revolution. Angela Davis said the revolution does not mean picking up arms. It means picking up truth. We know how we got here. We are safe in this church, but to be a citizen of this nation, to be a citizen of this city enjoying its largesse means that we have blood on our hands. Not just the white among us, but all of us have bloody hands. Metropolitan AME Church occupies the longest continuously held parcel of property by persons of African descent in the District of Columbia, but whose land was it first? Who was displaced in the name of God and progress and capitalism in order for us to occupy it? Washington, D.C. and Ward 3, not just to pick on Ward 3, but to share, have histories deeply rooted in intentional segregationist policies. Over the 20th century, a deliberate campaign was undertaken first by private developers and then enthusiastically joined by neighbors and district government to clear out the growing majority Black working class community known as Reno City. By 1950, all 370 families belonging to the original Reno City had been displaced. Their homes were torn down, and Fort Reno Park and Alice Deal Middle School were built in their place. I'm a part of an organization, the Washington Interfaith Network, that is organizing to develop at least 400 affordable housing units on public land in Ward 3, aligning with the number of households displaced through the destruction of Reno City. I want you to meet some of the displaced human beings who once called Reno City home. Madison Jones, who over 100 years ago was 32 years old, born in Virginia, a male citizen of the United States, a blacksmith unable to read or write, called Reno City home. Catherine Jones, 34 years old, born in Virginia, a housekeeper, called it home. Edward Jones, their 8-year-old son, born in Virginia, attended school, called it home. George Jones, 3-year-old son, born in Maryland. Georgiana Buckman, 17 years old, born in Virginia, a household worker, unable to read or write. They were citizens who were displaced. Even if we cannot know the full history of the Jones family and so many others, that does not diminish the fact that these machinations that move and displace people destroy stories and people. Fort Reno during the 20s and 30s represented a community progressively torn apart by the federal government, motivated by developers, and a nearby but wholly separated community. While Reno grew during the 20th century, so did Chevy Chase, a nearby affluent white suburb developed by the Chevy Chase Land Company. Throughout the 1920s, the company and the Chevy Chase Citizens Association aggressively, lobbied the federal government to seize Fort Reno, to develop schools and a park for their use. Despite residents' protests, in 1929, the National Capital Park and Planning Commission began buying houses in Reno and threatened those who refused to sell with condemnation. Throughout the following decade, most residents and the institutions that served them dispersed throughout D.C. So then what must we do? Why is the preacher talking about revolution? I am arguing for what Martin King called, toward the end of his life, a revolution of values that does not let us off the hook when we hold hands with someone of a different race. It does not let us off the hook when we are in interracial space. That does not congratulate us when we do nice things that don't interrupt policy, governmental policy that destroys lives, that moves us beyond conversations to the creation of the kind of city we know is possible. There is power in this room. There is money in this room. There are political connections in this room. Everybody here is an adult, and we know how the sausage gets made. We know that 10% of the people pay 60% of the taxes in D.C., and we know that by and large, whether the mayor be black or white, those people get what they want. Some of you undoubtedly are thinking, and you should be thinking, about political apathy among black people, poor people, dispossessed people. I would argue that this lack of engagement with our political system as it exists is not apathy. These people have seen what the Robert Moseses of New York did, and they know what the Robert Moseses of Washington, D.C. are doing today. They have witnessed both no promises and broken promises. When I have talked with folks struggling in D.C. about voting and participation in the system from a place of deep pain and rich understanding and keen intellect, they share with me an understanding about the American Imperial Impact Project, as it plays out in spaces in this city. They have said to me, as I have stood with them in Benning Terrace and Judiciary House, look at this shit. You vote. Here is the revolution that must come. We must not just advocate and do the policy work, but we must destroy the design segregation of this city. I can't remember the author. They talked about the fact that what segregation does in keeping us apart spatially is it makes sure that justice does not come because we do not live among one another. We do not cry together and share together. It is designed to keep the status quo enthroned. Segregation not just being about race, but about maintenance of the current power arrangements. The design and equitable distribution of resources that we see in the city, we know what to do about it. And those of us with power, and we all have power. My power may not be your power, but everybody here has power. We must stand, as Brian Stevenson says, in proximity with those in the places of pain and prove to them that we are not just assuaging our middle class, upper class, wealthy guilt, but we share their humanity. And that we will indeed work side by side with them because this is our city. And what happens to them happens to us. One of the things I've learned in Wynn as someone who has seen the sausage, I've been in rooms with developers, and they are some good people. But many of them, when confronted with losing margin, choose to keep things as they are. The 15,000 people that the mayor wishes to move into Ward 2 to staunch all of the young people who are leaving not just DC's inner core city, but inner cities around the nation. Those 15,000 people, who will they be? Who can afford to live in Ward 2? Very few of us. On the good news side, DC has one of the highest rates of black home ownership in the city. Yet, as has been shared, 51% of black home households are homeowners, which is far lower than the 70% of white households. But black homes in the district are worth far less than white homes. You all have read, and the media has covered, the black tax. In the district, black households have to save for an average of 13 years longer than white households for a down payment. And even though black home ownership is considerably higher in the district, those homes are undervalued, they're taxed at a higher level, and that happens to zero out much of the wealth accumulation and makes it difficult to pass from generation to generation. Our church has decided to do something about this in coalition. And may I share with you that we will never get the city we want in isolation. It must be coalition. Wynn is 50 congregations. Christian, Jewish, ethical humanists, all along the spectrum who share all of our vision for an equitable city. And racist public policy can only be undone with public policy that is not racist. But it will cost. And the question is, are we willing to pay more than a Saturday afternoon? It didn't take me long to realize, as a book title declares, that DC is indeed a sleepy southern town, masquerading as New York Light, L-I-T-E. You know the history. You know why we're not a state. You know that the government extracts, the federal government extracts from us here, and we have no vote, no power. Imagine those who have always lived here under that pall, without our kind of connections and power. Think about your dispossessed ancestors. Think about the dispossession happening in our city and the power we have to stop it. It will not be easy. I have learned in rooms of power in this city and elsewhere that people will fight us like hell. That if you really engage in this work, if we really engage in this work together, we will lose friends and status. But this is what revolution requires of us. To really engage in this work means that sometimes you will be in places with our elected officials and they may not shake your hand or speak to you. But I do believe that the only thing that can save us is a revolution in economics, a revolution in how wealth is shared, an understanding that we have always existed in a system where wealth is extracted from the poor and spread out amongst those who need it the least. That there has always been in the United States of America socialism for the wealthy and connected, and rugged capitalism for the poor and dispossessed. Let me leave with you some lyrics from Abby Lincoln, one of my favorite artists and probably one whom you all appreciate. This is from her album A Turtle's Dream, a song entitled Throw It Away. I think about the life I live, a figure made of clay, and think about the things I lost, the things I gave away. And when I'm in a certain mood, I search the house and look. One night I found these magic words in a magic book. Throw it away. Throw it away. Give your love, live your life each and every day, and keep your hands wide open. Let the sun shine through, because you can never lose a thing if it belongs to you. The power and influence and affluence that many of us have today belong to us. The power and influence that I have belongs to us. And change has not come and will not come until we throw away this power, influence, and affluence on behalf of us. Because when we give it away, it will come back to us for us to give away again. Thank you for listening.
Inspiring, both of you, and I am not sure now whether I should engage you in conversation or whether I should go out and mount the barricades. And I'm sure many of you feel the same way. But in the meantime, let's talk together now. And I have a few prepared questions here, and then I look forward to hearing your questions, and again, succinctly. The mayor's comeback plan proposes to increase amenities like grocery stores and parks in wards 7 and 8. And do you think there are risks to this? Like if once you upgrade those neighborhoods that it'll result in more displacement? And how can this be avoided? Either one of you.
Thank you. Great question. Yes, I do think there can be a risk of displacement if, again, we don't address all the other things that need to come with the grocery stores and the parks, which are things that I think that community wants and needs. So we have to think about, again, how can people remain and have that power to remain in Ward 7 and 8, and also have the power to influence and direct how those investments are made. Those would be the two things that I would highlight for that.
And may I have a question. Again, I'm very clear about what I do not know. So my question there would be, when we get these plans, and I've seen a lot of these plans where our elected officials and public administrators say, we're going to do this, what teeth are there to hold accountable? Because often what I think happens is this is decorous rhetoric to allow space for other things to occur.
Yeah. And I certainly can understand that perspective, and because we've seen that happen, of course, and it's easy to look at that plan and see all the nice language, all the high aspirations, and yet not be convinced, right? Because where is the teeth behind it? Where is where's the clear expression of will that this is what we want to create and we're not going to accept less than this? So I think it depends somewhat on all of us to make sure that our leaders hear that message, that we hold them accountable and we make them articulate how we're going to know. How are they going to make sure we know that they've done the things that they said they would do, and that we're going to hold them accountable for that? And I think, again, that also goes back to the people in those communities having the power and the voice that they need to create that accountability.
I think the bridge project that you mentioned is going to be a real test of that, because its organizers have done as much as anybody to make sure that there is no displacement, and at the same time you've made it so attractive that it's the kind of place that everyone, those affluents want to come flocking to. So let's see if you can make it work at the bridge, then maybe it can be replicated.
Yeah.
Jury's out. Okay. Oh, good. Oh, they're coming in already. Let's see. Modest single-family homes and 4-unit apartment buildings, unprotected by rent stabilization, are often purchased and demolished by developers who want to build, for new, wealthier people. What can the city do to preserve that kind of naturally existing affordable housing?
Yeah, great question. I mean, that is a really tough space at the moment, because the reality is we have a lot of great tools for larger apartment buildings. We need to use them better. But for the smaller properties and for single-family homes, it's harder. And a trend that's been happening, not just in D.C., but in other places around the U.S., is corporations buying smaller properties, corporations buying homes and renting them out. And so, again, I think it's helping to stabilize the homeowners who are in those properties now, first of all, so that they don't need to sell because they are in financial difficulty or because of taxes. But I think, to be honest, it's a hard question, because obviously people, if somebody wants to sell their home, they can sell it to whomever they like, and we don't have any way to really prevent that. I think we can maybe do more, though, to kind of limit some of the practices and give more of the nonprofits an opportunity to acquire some of those properties. And that's often challenging, because when people can pay cash for something, like big companies, they can get in there faster and do things. So maybe if there's ways we can kind of slow the process down a little bit, so there's opportunities for things like community land trusts or others to get involved and maybe preserve more of that housing.
And you're the person we need to be talking to. But I saw in the newspaper, and I don't know if it was the Times or the Post, they had data by zip code, and you could search what percentage of the homes in your zip code were purchased in cash. And it's a huge, huge thing. What policy solutions are you familiar with that might be able to slow that down?
Yeah, well,
I'm taking your job. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Well, I think the challenge was we lost the part of TOPA, the DC Tenant Opportunity Purchase Act, that covered single-family homes, and that would have been one tool that would have allowed us an opportunity, because under that policy, as some of you may be familiar, if I'm renting in a renter in a larger building now in DC, and the owner wants to sell the building, I can join with my other tenants in the building and make a competing offer to purchase that building. And that used to apply to any rental property, even single-family homes, and it doesn't anymore. So that's one possibility, is to look back at that again.
These are hard to implement. Okay. How do you respond to the contradiction presented by the mayor? How do you respond to the contradiction presented by the mayor's goal to increase Black household income to $75,000 in 5 years, and her racial equity plan that took a year to draft, and of course has been criticized as being a plan focused on box checking? And you could sort of say like how realistic you think that 75,000 and how you guys think that maybe it can be achieved.
So one thing to note is the down payment assistance went up to about $200,000. That does help, but in our building power, sitting at tables. Thursday, spent half of the day with Chairman Middleton, with Brooke Pinto, and we were doing some stuff in the Wilson building. Public land must stay in the hands of the city for development so that people can stay in the city. So what we call Reservation 13, that land over by RFK, I mean, and I don't mean to offend anyone because I am not a sports fan. The only reason I know the Super Bowl is on Sunday is because my brother told me I don't follow this. I don't think that land should fall in the hands of a sports team. I don't think that is a priority for us, that if the mayor is serious, public land must stay out of the hands of those whose primary motivation is profit. And the only way that can happen is if all of us together make it so. That's one piece, because you either buy down the cost of land or people are offered opportunity for down payments. It's all, I mean, there are other things, but it all depends, it's money, it's transfer. And so we have not been able, even when we were fighting for equitable development, a third market rate, a third moderate. I know we can argue about the distinction, and then a third workforce, poor, radically affordable. We got so much pushback on that because we also know that creating islands of poverty doesn't help anyone. So it is extraordinarily complicated. And the last thing I'll say is, when you fight to win the thing up front, you've got to organize to keep the power, to keep it from being taken away. Because the minute it is inked, there are phone calls and donations and parties and all of this trying to undo it. And we know that, and we have to remain vigilant.
And you agree?
Yes, for sure. And, one thing I would say too, Reverend Lamar talked about, the cost of doing some of these things. And I would agree, of course, it does cost money to do some of these things, but it's also an investment, right? And I think I would like to frame it more that way. One of the things I mentioned in my talk from the history was at a time when white people in D.C. didn't want to pay for the education of Black children and in public schools. And in addition, when I read that, to the moral outrage of that, I was also just struck by the sheer stupidity of it. Like, what good will come of not educating children? And so I think we need to think about it more that way, that there's an investment to be made in the people of the District of Columbia that we need to make, and will benefit them and benefit us if we make that investment.
Now, let's go back to this, getting the African American income up. There are lots and lots of adult African Americans with essentially no skills or very low skills. And whenever there's a program about like, let's up the income, we're going to train the young people, etc. But meanwhile, there's a cohort of people who have at least half of their lives left to live, who want to be productive and have no skills. Now, what are we going to do with that group of people to bring them into productive activity and out of poverty?
Well, of course, I think there are a number of efforts that are trying to do that, to re-educate people, and that's something I should say. I mean, it's even me. Like I need to be re-educated sometimes in work things because there's new school skills that I need to acquire. So it's not something necessarily unique to lower income people, but it is more essential for them. This is one where maybe I might defer to some of my colleagues at Urban Institute who study kind of workforce issues more closely. But again, I would go back to the framing of the investment that, we can have somebody who's dependent on the public sector or somebody who's able to be more economically independent. Which one is it that we would prefer? I think that's a clear choice. And then we need to make those investments to make that happen.
One of the experiences that I have around First Source is that there are few teeth. Like, First Source is all gums. And it becomes a challenge. I mean, I respect those who say they cannot find DC residents, but I'm a part of a number of communities that offer them, but still there is not enough being done to hold folks accountable. So I was one of those who thought the work was done when you had pretty public policy, but if it is not enforced, you still have what you have.
Thank you. The failure to enforce First Source is, of course, one of our biggest sort of in your face, we're not serious actions by the city. We're getting quite a few questions on vouchers and rent stabilization. And let's see. Has the rent stabilization program been successful? Should it be expanded? Hold on, I'm going to throw a couple of these. When the city uses HUD funds to pay vouchers that are significantly above market rate rents in older buildings, doesn't that work against the goal of preserving affordable housing? Let's see.
Sorry, could you repeat that question? Because I'm not sure.
Okay, when the city uses HUD funds to pay vouchers that are significantly above market rents in older buildings, doesn't that work against the preserve part of your goals vis-a-vis DC's rent stabilization laws?
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. And so you can treat those two together, or?
Yes. So to take the first question, has rent stabilization been a success? I wish I knew the answer to that. It's really hard to assess it when, first of all, the city doesn't even really know exactly which buildings have rent stabilization in it. This has been a frustration of mine for many years as a housing researcher in DC. Just the city does not actually have a database of those properties, nor do we have any great data on what the rents are in those buildings versus what rents are in other buildings. So it's hard on a factual level to really assess what's been going on with rent stabilization over the years. I do know, of course, that there are concerns about the use of voluntary agreements and other things that are undermining some of the protections that are supposed to be in rent stabilization. I also know that there's some concerns right now because inflation is high and the rent stabilization ceilings are tied to inflation. So we're facing the prospect right now of an 8% increase in the rent stabilization ceilings, which would allow landlords to increase rents more than they have been previously. Whether they'll do that or not is a whole other question. But again, I think there's some things that people are very concerned about there. On the voucher question, I also have heard a lot about this. I understand the concerns about vouchers. I think from my perspective, vouchers are a great tool. It's something we need. And a weakness in the program previously was the amount of rent you could use with a voucher was not high enough to be able to rent in many parts of DC. So we have fixed that. But I think the issue of whether we should have let people charge more than rent stabilized rents if they're renting to a voucher holder was something that wasn't necessarily foreseen by anybody when the law was written many, many years ago, and has had some unfortunate consequences. I'll put it that way. So I do think, though, that, I want to be careful about this because, again, the voucher program before wasn't really working the way it was intended, in that it was not giving people enough choice. So we've expanded the choice, and that's a good thing. I do think we want to now reassess whether we've got it quite right. And these are always things that sometimes it's complicated to get it exactly right.
Could you explain, what you see as the problems now that there's expanded choice? You said maybe we didn't get some things quite right. What exactly are you talking about?
So what I've heard is from folks that I work with is that there have been buildings where it's now become like a big financial incentive for an owner to just fill their building with voucher holders versus other people who might want to live in those buildings because they can charge a higher rent, because they don't need to charge the rent control rent to a voucher holder. They can charge a higher, more close to market rent. So I don't think we want to create an incentive where somebody is really financially incentivized to fill their unit with vouchers, but fill their apartment building with vouchers. But at the same time, again, that there may not have been any voucher holders getting access to those units before at all. So we've got to kind of figure out the right line there.
And the problem with having too many voucher holders in one building is what, in your view?
I don't know that I think there's necessarily a problem per se, but I'm not sure that we wanted to create a situation where that's like what we're incentivizing.
Okay. What do you think about social housing? I know that's sort of, it's got its advocates, it's got its opponents. That's for both of you.
Well, that's what I was going to. So I know that people have different ideas about what social housing means. Did the questioner offer any definition or?
What do you understand social housing to be?
So I may not have. This is not a topic that I'm fully up on. So I guess I don't want to really delve into that too much.
Okay.
So sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Apologies.
No.
Pete, I heard an NPR story on it, so I'm an expert, so I'll tip my.
You got any views on social housing, Reverend? Okay, well, all right, so step one, our leaders have to be better educated on what social housing is.
Yes.
Let's see. This is a curious one. Some experts maintain that the days of building significant equity through home ownership are over. If home ownership is still a way to pass on generational wealth, what are some important underpinnings for low-income minority households to attain? So in order to maintain the financial and managerial demands of home ownership. But first, what do you think about it? Is home ownership still the answer to generational wealth?
I don't know that I have heard that it's not a way to build equity anymore. I'm not quite sure where that has come from. And I look at house prices in DC, and I think there's a lot of people building equity every day. So that's one thing. I do think that it is a part of the process of building equity for many families, and that is something, again, we need to make sure that more people have access to that opportunity, and to pass on that generational wealth. But there's also other ways. And, another program that is something that is gaining traction around the country and is part of the landscape here in DC is baby bonds, as a way of investing in children at a very early age and in providing them with savings that they can then use for a variety of things. Because we don't want to exclusively make home ownership the only way you can generate wealth and build wealth, right? Because not everyone is going to be a homeowner or not be a homeowner all the time. So I think we need to have other things besides home equity. The other thing is, I think that we run into challenges when we focus too much on home values as like a way of building wealth, and then people complain if we do something that then they perceive as like harming their home value some way, even though sometimes I think they maybe are imagining that some of those things are going to be harmful when they might not be. So I think we have to also understand that like homeownership is a way to build housing stability. It's a way for you to have a place to live that's a good place. In addition to, hopefully, there's some financial benefit over the long term as well.
Okay. Gosh. What's an equitable way to address DC's homelessness crisis?
Anecdotally, I think all of us are seeing the clearing of public spaces where our unhoused siblings struggle. I can remember working with someone with whom you all may be familiar, Reverend Grayland Hagler, who I think is one of the great citizens of this city. The beginning is that housing should be a human right, that every human being ought to have housing, and we have to figure out how to fund that. Now, one of the challenges is that near our congregation, and I'm sure maybe near your homes or congregations, places of business, places of leisure, you see unhoused people, and their being unhoused is partly due to the need for social services, for mental health services, psychological issues. We actually had someone that we were trying to help who preferred to stay where they were because there they could do what they wanted to do. Think about it. In my home, I'm able to do what I want to do. Those who are unhoused lose the right, really, to determine in many places how they are to live, and they push back against it. It's an extraordinarily complex thing, but I believe that we need to think of housing, good education, a number of things, not as things to be ultimately commodified, but by the fact that I'm a human being, it should be afforded to me, and we should figure out how to do that. But
Well, okay. Do you think we should clear the tent cities? Now, that was a long-term solution, and an expensive solution. The mayor's clearing tent cities today. Should she stop? And if she shouldn't, and if she should not stop, then what should she do with the people immediately moved? And we know in a couple of instances they like shoveled up the occupant with the tent. And you work with the downtown business people, so you have their thoughts too.
I'm sorry, I don't really work with the downtown business people. I'm not sure what that meant.
You are familiar with, you have done studies.
So, no, I am not in favor of clearing
Okay.
that in that way at all. I think that that's not a humane and good solution. And I think that at the same time, I think, having people in those 10 communities is obviously not great for them either. So we need to find better solutions. And permanent housing is one of those. So giving people an opportunity. I worked for a long time at Urban Institute with woman Martha Bird, who was one of the foremost homelessness researchers in America. And I remember something she told me very clearly is that I have never seen anybody who, if you didn't dangle a set of keys in front of them, wouldn't follow you and go to that place. So if you give them a real solution, a real option, then they will follow it. And I don't think we need to do those other things.
Okay. Are welfare, are the motels a short-term solution?
we were advocating for that. And what I have heard recently is that there are some hotels that the city wants to purchase to help as a solution. Have you heard that? Okay, so it's in the wind. I hope, but again, as we know, without what folks call wraparound services and other things, it won't be what it needs to be.
That's the primary problem. It's not just, a room and autonomy, okay? Gosh, so many good questions here. We just got one about community land trusts. Are they part of the solution? And okay.
Yeah, sure. No, community land trusts are definitely a great tool. One part of the work that Bridge Park did was to help stand up the Douglas Community Land Trust, which is now operating. It is still a challenge, though. So the way community land trusts work is they acquire land and make that available for either for new development, or sometimes it's land that's already built on, and they'll help preserve, the affordable housing that's there already. But again, like in a hot market like DC, it's hard to acquire property. So even the Douglas Community Land Trust, it took a while for them to get their first property, and and now they're trying to, gain additional properties. So it is a good model. It's a successful model, but it needs persistence and it needs some time to get to work successfully.
Okay. And we've had a couple of questions come through about reparations. And should we just do reparations instead of having these various, piecemeal or fragmented public programs? And how would reparations work?
I think the scholarship of Sandy Darity is helpful there. Some of you all may know his work. The baby bonds and stuff comes out of his work. I was actually at a table with some Jewish brothers and sisters recently talking about reparations. I think that reparations definitely should be on the table. I think it's a possible solution. But let me tell you what my fears are. There is a long history in America around backlash. So with Reconstruction, and you have to read, if you haven't read Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, which takes away the lie and the myth that when Black people were controlling many legislatures and many executive mansions in the South, that the country went to hell. So the whole birth of a nation is tremendous propaganda. We know that when the occupant of the White House saw it at that time, he said it was like history written in lightning. You mentioned public schools. Well, in Alabama and South Carolina, when Black people took over the legislatures, they made sure there was mandatory public school for every child, Black and white. We know that if whites had maintained power, they never would have done the same for Black children. There's just no way to read American history and see that coming out of that time. I raise that to say that after Reconstruction, tremendous backlash, rise of the Klan, the only way that, and I'd say we do not live in a democracy. We have to give birth to one. The Electoral College is extraordinarily anti-democratic. The United States Senate, extraordinarily anti-democratic. That the only way you had something that looked like democracy in the South was when it was occupied by soldiers. And when they left, you got the rise of the Klan, you got politics by violence. Well, where we're living right now, January 16th, the Trump moment, it also is a backlash. Just with, having a Black person occupy a political office does not mean that Black people control power. Because we all know that occupants in offices, we know that. And so the backlash that we see now, I have no clue. I don't know if America could survive it. Reparations. I think that right now we're living in the rubble of a crumbling empire that is really hastening to its demise. The propaganda we have as Americans that we'll last forever, it's not going to happen. And I think at the rate we're going, whenever that terminus is, it's getting closer and closer. So I think it is a fair thing to do. I think that the United States of America, in the District of Columbia and elsewhere, those who own human beings received checks for the value of the people they own. And Jewish brothers and sisters were offered some form of reparations. Some Native communities have been offered some form of reparations. The only people who have not gotten anything like that, and it's not fair to say only, but are Black people. That is because fundamentally this is an anti-democratic and anti-Black reality that we occupy in the United States of America. It's just the truth.
I just want to just say, so I totally appreciate the cautions that the Reverend shared, but just personally, I want to say I would be in favor of reparations. I think it's just to offer reparations, and I just wanted to say that.
We're approaching the end of our time together, and a lot of our questions and discussions have focused on housing equity. But I wanted to give each of you a chance to discuss, if you like, equity in another sense or in a larger sense, or to sort of sum up what you think are going to be, or what you said should be the immediate next steps, and what we as, active citizens should immediately think about doing.
Deferring, I don't often get to defer in my life. I could get used to this deferring.
Thank you, Reverend. All right. Well, to me, maybe if I was to take a step back and sum up a little bit, to me, it somewhat comes down to choice and power. The issues we're talking about, take housing, jobs, all these other things we've discussed today. Giving people the choice and the opportunity, giving them the power to control their own lives, is really what every human being deserves. And we've denied it to people in our society. And so rectifying that, I think, is ultimately what we're trying to do. It doesn't mean, of course, that everyone gets to do exactly what they want all the time. That's not true for any of us. But everyone should have the same opportunities and choices and the equal opportunity to advance and be happy.
I cannot improve upon that. I agree.
Okay. Would you hold that slide up again, please? 3 minutes. Okay. Good. Great. So this means that now here, this is another summation type question that comes. Given the very large wealth disparities between Black and white residents, is racial equity achievable or even approachable?
We must move in that direction. It has taken us untold generations to get here. It will take us many generations to get out. But we have a responsibility now that we know how we got here to do what is necessary to undo those things. And we have to teach the generations behind us that we have a blood debt to make sure that we stay the course. And again, as I say, remind myself all the time that victories are never permanent, that we must mobilize to keep justice once it is achieved, or once it is approximated. So.
Do you think reparations are approachable? I'm sorry.
Reparation or racial
I'm sorry,
equity?
not reparations, but equity. Is equity approachable or achievable?
I believe it's achievable, even though there have been times, especially over the past few years, when the world has given me reasons to doubt. But I think we have to keep the faith. But I also think we need to realize that we won't get there by doing only the things we've done up till now, that much more is needed from all of us. So.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you. This has been wonderful. And can I ask for more
Yes, thank you to our speakers, and to Laura for moderating. This conversation will be available on YouTube in the next day or two. So if you want to listen to it again, you sort of missed something, because there was certainly a lot of meat in the discussion that all of you brought to this group here. So there are going to be refreshments out in the lobby. Our next conversation is going to be March 11th here in the church. It's going to be on climate change. So that should be very, very topical. We're going to be focusing in part on Anacostia and the Anacostia area. So and the bridge project is sort of part of that. So hope you can all join us on March 11th and join us in the lobby. And thank you again. Thank you.